Welcome everyone to this Software Center Theme 1 brown bag seminar on how to fail at continuous practices in 3 simple steps. My name is Ståhl, and just a reminder, we're recording this session so that we can share it later with those who couldn't join us today. And for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about, first of all, a quick introduction to the subject. Why is this important at all? And also, who am I anyway? Then the 3 steps to failure here is don't ask what it is. Don't ask why, just do it. That's the very simple recipe for failing at continuous practices that we'll talk about today. Then we'll touch a little bit on further reading if you want to dig deeper, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. I'm not so sure about answers. I'll do my best, but at least we'll squeeze in a few questions. So, who am I? I spend most of my time at Ericsson, ostensibly as a subject matter expert at Group Function Technology. What I do there is mostly things like development practice, continuous integration, delivery and deployment, things to do with software product quality, supply chain integrity, data-driven practices, and it's probably going to be something different tomorrow. I also do a little bit of research. I write books on occasions. I have my PhD from the University of Groningen. This talk is based on research that we have been doing within Software Center, primarily with my excellent research colleagues, Thorvald Mortensson, Jan Boch, and Antonio Martini. So credit where credit is due. However, all the crazy things I'm about to say are entirely on me, so don't blame them for any of that. When I'm not at Ericsson, I spend a bit of time at Linköping University as an associate professor of software engineering. So, for the last decade, or more than that really, we have been talking a lot in this industry about continuous just about everything really, and it's very easy to find books and blogs and papers and articles and what have you about how to succeed with one or the other continuous practice. So it seems like kind of a solved problem, but that's not really what we're going to be talking about today. Today's success is not on the menu, but we'll be talking about how to produce a proper train wreck. And this is all based on true stories of others, obviously, not from my particular company or your particular company. I'm sure you're familiar with the saying, mistakes were made, but not by me. That's very much the spirit in which we'll be having this conversation. There seems to be a lot of continuous practices out there, and the big 3 ones obviously are continuous integration, delivery, and deployment. But if you just search around the internet, you can easily find others like continuous release and continuous security and continuous architecture, continuous just about anything. And that could lead you to start considering things like, what does any of this actually mean anyway? How are these different continuous practices different? What do we mean by this word continuous that we like to slap onto everything? And do these things overlap? Or are they completely separate? Does one lead to the next? So if I'm doing continuous delivery, that will naturally lead me to doing continuous deployment, or does one require the other? Do I have to be doing continuous security, whatever that is, in order to be doing continuous release? Maybe they are options to choose from, like from a smorgasbord. I can choose whether I should do continuous integration or I should do continuous architecture. And if so, what are their benefits and costs so that I can make such a decision? Now, you need to stop asking such questions very quickly because they could reveal some uncomfortable truths. Imagine you are in a board meeting or a leadership team meeting or something like that, and you have decided that you are going to invest in continuous delivery, say. If you start asking what this actually means, it could reveal that you have actually assumed different things. You have agreed on a term with very different ideas of what that means. which could lead you to heading off into different directions, thinking you have the same plan, but actually executing on very different objectives. Is essentially that your strategy is based on hyped up puffs of smoke, which is not a very, that can be pretty awkward. So you don't want to ask these questions too much. Now, a very clever person, more clever than me, Philip Kruchten, once said back in 2007, actually, about agile practices in general, that unlike genes, which are almost digitally coded, memes are often replicated with a low fidelity as soon as they become a tad complex. Agile memes are not immune to this rapid drift, which you think is rather an understatement and very much applies to continuous practices. Now, if you don't want to take my advice for it and actually try to define what you mean by continuous integration in your organization or any of the other continuous practices, I can give you a starting point, some input on how you could define this. You're not going to be able to find the definition because there are many definitions out there. People simply do not agree what this means. So a reasonable aiming point would be that you in your organization have a clear understanding what you mean by any of this. And if so, you could think about it like this. Continuous integration is a developer practice where developers integrate their work frequently. Usually each person integrates at least daily, leading to multiple integrations per day. I think for many of you, this definition is familiar, but probably a little bit different from what you have read elsewhere. Continuous delivery, on the other hand, is a development practice where every change is treated as a potential release candidate to be frequently and rapidly evaluated through one's pipeline, and that one is always able to deploy and release the latest working version, but may decide not to, for instance, for business reasons. Now, there are a few emphasized terms here. We're saying that continuous integration is a developer practice, and that is because it's ultimately something that the individual developer does or does not do. In other words, you as an organization do not get to say that we shall continuously integrate. You can encourage it, you can enable it, you can impede it, but you can't really decide it. We see in case studies that you can have the most advanced automated test suite imaginable. You can have the fanciest pipeline in the world, and yet different teams and different members of single teams will behave very differently. Some people simply will not continuously integrate, whereas others very happily will. Able to deploy and or release is also key. And this actually goes back, if you read what Jez Humble originally wrote in Continuous Delivery, the book, he's very clear on this point. When we speak about continuous delivery, we don't actually mean delivering to the customer. We mean being able to do that if we want to. And that's a crucial distinction, because then we can think about continuous deployment as something different, namely an operations practice, where release candidates evaluated in continuous delivery are frequently and rapidly placed in a production environment, the nature of which may differ depending on technological context. So what we're saying here is continuous deployment doesn't really have anything to do with development. It's simply, how do I take this release candidate that I'm provided with and put it into operations? So it's an operations practice. If you want to read more about this and also put it into context with DevOps, there's an excellent paper, Continuous Practices and DevOps, Beyond the Buzz, What Does It All Mean? It provides some more background, discusses this in more depth, and also does a discussion of contemporary literature, what people actually have to say about this. The second step here is don't ask why. And the reason is continuous practices have all kinds of far-reaching impacts, and those impacts go far beyond research and development. So depending on how you interpret these practices, how you implement them, and what your focus is, you can see very different effects. You could ask things like, which benefits are we truly optimizing for? When interests come into conflict, as they are wont to do, what do we prioritize? And how does this fit into our go-to-market strategy? And how does it support our business strategy? And how does it line up with our customers' expectations? For instance, do our customers actually want us to continuously deploy to them? Or how do they want us to behave? Again, these are dangerous questions that you want to shy away from, because if you start asking questions like that, you could realize that continuous whatever it is that you have invested in actually does not serve your interests. And you could realize that whatever you have read about in some blog or book that is described as the next greatest thing actually only applies to a limited context, and that context is not your context. And of course, if you find yourself thoroughly invested in continuous delivery or continuous deployment, there can be a lot of money associated to this and a lot of prestige, which is why these questions can be very awkward and very dangerous. So that's why you want to stay away from them, to ensure that you truly and properly fail at continuous practice. Now, in a recent case study we conducted, one interviewee put it very eloquently, I believe. The technology is very much driven by tooling communities, focusing on how to do it, not what to do. And I think that is quite true. Much of what we see in continuous practices is driven by the tools and the communities that spring up around the tools. And they tend to give you very good answers and very good solutions for how to build a pipeline. But when it comes to what this pipeline actually does and what it is for and how it fits into the business at large, that becomes very much up to ourselves. And if we do not take that responsibility, things can get very interesting very quickly. Now, if you want to start asking why, you can do that for each individual practice. And based on what you might read about continuous integration, for instance, you could ask yourself, are we doing this because we want improved quality, or maybe for improved predictability or efficiency or speed, or because we want easier troubleshooting, or because we want transparency and feedback? And if so, of what and to whom and from whom? Maybe we want to do it to enable continuous delivery, or maybe we just want to do it because it feels good, which can be a perfectly valid reason. And this is all based on what you might read in various blogs and papers and so forth. So there are many, many different benefits proposed by different sources. And depending on how you interpret continuous integration, you might plausibly realize several of these benefits, but probably not all of them. If you want to consider continuous delivery, then you might ask yourself, are we doing this for improved quality or improved predictability, improved efficiency, speed, easier? Well, you get the point. And this is because when you, again, reading literature, much of the same benefits are proposed for continuous delivery as well as for continuous integration. And for continuous deployment, if we read about that, we can read about all kinds of benefits. And you might want to ask yourself, are we doing that to improve our quality or improve predictability or any of the other benefits? Which again goes to tell the same story, that people tend to mean rather different things when they speak of these practices. So it could be useful for you to explicate what you mean when you seek to adopt them. We have been studying these continuous practices for the better part of 8 years, I think it is now, in numerous companies, numerous cases, and we have seen many examples of how these things can go well and how they can go not so well. And to give you an idea of what a typical scenario might look like in a product development effort of non-trivial size. So this tends to happen in somewhat larger projects, mostly. It might go a little bit like this. You start automating the tests you have that can easily be automated, because after all, automation is a good thing and you have to start somewhere, so why not start where it's easy and save the hard bits for later? That seems like a sound strategy. And as you do that, you tend to build up larger and larger automated test suites, because after all, the more the merrier. The more tests you have, the more faults you can catch, and everybody's happy. But as time goes by, you begin to realize that you actually have too many tests, and there's no way you can execute them for every change. Not for a single configuration, but especially for situations where you have multiple deployment scenarios and multiple configurations, so the kind of combinatorial complexity grows exponentially, which makes executing your entire test scope simply impossible. So at that point, you might want to start trying to chip away at the test suites and reduce them. And you might think, well, let's be clever about this and only execute the most valuable test cases for any given change. You want to do that in real time, say. You want to have some automated intelligence so that for every change that is pushed, let's decide what would give us the most value for this particular change. And that might be because you might look at tests that were recently executed. You might want to prioritize tests that have not been executed in a long time, or tests that recently failed. Or you might want to look at tests that tend to fail or succeed in clusters. Then maybe we can only choose one or a few of those and not execute all of them. You might want to prioritize tests based on metadata mapping to entities that are important, such as requirements that were affected by this particular change. There are all kinds of interesting things we might want to try to do, but chances are, if you have followed this path, you will get stuck trying to select these tests. And the reason is that your test suite and your infrastructure was never designed for this kind of precision. They were designed simply to execute and do that thoroughly and speedily. So problems you might encounter are things like your pipeline is actually this polyglot system with many different test frameworks where tests are locked into the different technologies, so you can't choose across the entire space of test cases available to you because they are locked into different technological solutions. You might realize that the test cases you have don't have the metadata you would need in order to do intelligent selection. You might realize that the pipeline doesn't have the traceability you would need in order to dynamically select tests based on what just happened in previous executions. You might also realize that you don't have any kind of atomic test cases, but rather you have large test suites with many test cases that are always executed in a particular order. And since that has always been the case, you have created hidden dependencies in between the test cases. So when you try to pick one up and execute it in isolation, it will fail because it actually required other tests to be executed before it to succeed. So these are all common phenomena. And then you might think, well, actually, we need to rebuild this thing more or less from scratch. Now that we finally realize what we actually want to use this thing for, we need to build it differently. But somewhere along the way, even though you started out simply automating for convenience, for efficiency, for consistency, somewhere along the way from those humble beginnings, your pipeline has become mission critical. And if it fails, then you will be unable to release software, which makes major changes to it kind of like open heart surgery, which is scary. And then chances are you will shy away from those more fundamental restructurings and end up in a place where you expend more or less infinite resources trying to cope with ever-growing test suites, because during this time, your product doesn't stand still. It will keep growing and evolving, and the test scope will grow. And so you will add more and more tests. And at the same time, you're under greater and greater pressure to deliver speedily. So this becomes a game that is basically impossible to win, and can swallow up immense resources, both human resources and computational resources. And yet, at the end of the day, this suspicion might creep in that for all your efforts and all these automated tests, they can't really detect any failure modes that you didn't anticipate in the first place. Because these automated tests are great at verifying requirements, say, but requirements are never complete and they are never free from error. And customer expectations go way beyond requirements. And so even for all that testing, the customer keeps encountering failures to meet their expectations. And this is especially true in very large systems where emergent behaviors start to become evident. Things that are more or less impossible to predict beforehand. So this is not a happy place to be in. And we have been looking in our work at different approaches to try to get towards continuous delivery from a different angle, trying not to follow this path, but well, following a more strategic path. And that is in a paper, Won't Somebody Please Think of the Tests? Unfortunately not yet published, but if you want to read more about this and are interested, then do please feel free to poke me and I'll be happy to share it with you. Now, if you want to read more, I would warmly recommend Continuous Delivery by Jezumble. It's an oldie but goodie, but it's one of those books where I feel as if people are happy to refer to it and sometimes cite it. But if people actually read it more, many of the problems that we see again and again in our research would not be as problematic. For instance, I believe Jezumble was very prescient when he wrote the book, and many of the things that we discuss today and which we encounter in our research, he managed to predict those. And for instance, he very clearly says, don't think that you will be able to automate all your tests, because many tests are simply not suitable for automation. So it's a great book. It has a few years on it now, but still very relevant. Another book is Continuous Practice by yours truly and Thorvald Mortensson. It takes a little bit more strategic perspective. It touches upon many of the things that we have gone through in this presentation and provides some hands-on tools and strategies for how you might think about this, how you might think about what my particular context is and what of that context actually pertains to how I might want to implement continuous practice, and which continuous practices are even relevant in my particular case, and how I want to onboard my organization with that, because it's much more than just a question of technology. If you want to get a little bit more nerdy about it, there is a list of published research that I have been involved in. You can find that at danielståhl.co/software engineering research. Obviously, that's just research that I have participated in. If you want to more generally read research on continuous practices, then I think Google Scholar is your best friend. Just go there and type in continuous delivery or whatever you want to read about, and you will have plenty of reading to do. If you do want to reach out, you can reach me at ericsson.com or liu.se or my private mail address, depending on which capacity you want to have that conversation. So with that, we do have a few minutes left for questions. So any thoughts, reflections on this? And I can't see the chat, so if you're typing in the chat, then perhaps someone can read it out loud.
Hi, Daniel. Can you hear me? Wilhelm
Yes,
here.
I can hear you.
Okay. Best presentation this far. By far.
Thank you.
Very, very good. Okay. Generally speaking, not to point out anyone, where do you think we are as software industry today, looking at those three continuous practices you went through?
And who then would we be? Like software-centric companies in general, or what were we talking
I was
about?
thinking, no, in general, if you look around the world,
The industry.
Yeah, the software industry. So are we mature? Are we still a long way to go? Yeah, you know.
I don't think there's any good answer I can give to that. What I see is there's a lot of difference where people do take things more or less seriously and take a more or less strategic versus tactical approach to this. I have worked with companies who try to think this through upfront and people who kind of stumble into it. I think there are differences between segments of the industry. Many of the software-centric companies tend to be very much embedded software or coming from an embedded software background, where these practices are more challenging than in a cloud-native environment, although not impossible for the most part. So are kind of waking up to this slightly later than more cloud-native segments of the industry. I guess that would be my very, very quick take on it. Does that answer your question, or do you have another perspective?
Okay, so you are still needed.
Oh, well, who knows? I'm not one to say.
Okay, thanks.
All right, then thank you so much for attending. It was my pleasure to talk to you today about this. Before we close, I think maybe, I don't know if Jan Carlson is present, but this is part of a brown bag seminar series. So there will be another installment next Monday, I believe, from a different theme in Software Center.
Yes, so next week we will have a presentation from Abu Nasser Masood titled Analyzing Software Code Based on Artificial Neural Networks.
All right, looking forward to that. Okay, again, thank you so much. Let's wrap this up and enjoy the rest of your Monday.